Hi everybody, this is my final case presentation. I do my practicum with the Trevor Project, so it is a little bit unique, but I was able to pull a case that was relevant enough for all of these standards, and I'm excited to share it with you. Firstly, when you are watching this video, I'd like you to keep in mind a couple of questions and discuss them at the end of the presentation. The first one is because this is a crisis hotline, I can only connect with this client once. If this were a different therapist-client relationship, how would you organize sessions going forward? The second question is client asked if they were abused. On the Trevor Project, we aren't allowed to diagnose or give opinions. Instead, I reflected their story back to them and provided definitions of abuse. How would you navigate this question? And the third one to consider is would you provide self-disclosure if you have it in the session? Why or why not? Here's the case overview. Just to note, the nature of the Trevor Project is anonymous, so all identifying information is protected. What I can share is that the client is an adult male. They were referred by their therapist for in-between session support to us at the Trevor Project. They live with their partner and his kids. The presenting problem is the client presented symptoms of anxiety and depression. They are navigating a past relationship they are now understanding as abusive. Some of the relevant history was that the client was in a polyamorous relationship with their current partner and that partner's previous wife. The wife was emotionally, physically, and sexually abusive. The client I was speaking with is in the LGBTQ+ community in a rural town that is not accepting. The client had a significant age difference from both partners. To get some engagement with this client, I established rapport by validating and normalizing the time that it took to identify abusive behaviors, as well as the guilt and shame that comes with it. This client was really concerned with the fact that they were not aware that this was as bad as it was when it was happening, and I tried to normalize that, as that is very normal and very common. I addressed challenges by reflecting their own experiences back to them, reframing what abuse is and how they identify it. Because even though they were like, I think that this relationship was abusive, they still were unsure. Some of the potential barriers to progress was that the client was feeling responsible for the abuse, scared to report it, and that they have to see the abusive person when she brings the kids to the client's partner. So still some contact with this abusive person, which can be intense and bring up past things. The client-worker relationship was strong. It took a minute to build rapport, as it does with anyone, and I think it's a little bit more difficult when you're not face-to-face. That means that I had to up the motivational interviewing, I had to up the empathy and empathetic language because they can't see my mannerisms or hear my voice. It is really important that the language is strong going forward. There was no official biopsychosocial spiritual assessment done. However, there is, a case record that we keep with some of the factors. I did use the risk assessment for suicide risk. Some of the considerations for this is that they had a past attempt of suicide. They have current passive suicidal thoughts within the past few days, no intent or action to harm themselves, so that created them as a medium risk client. Here's just an example of what a risk assessment decision tree looks like for the Trevor Project. As for intervention and planning, the theoretical frameworks used was person-centered. We always focus on the client and their descriptions of what happened to them. Especially because this was their first time naming this experience as abusive, it was really important to use the language that they used instead of plant new words or ideas in their head. The Trevor Project is backed with motivational interviewing to gather information and reflect them back to the individual to help process the trauma. Also, we did a little bit of psychoeducation on the abuse. The session was client-led, which every session is, which allowed them to talk about their traumatic experience when they were ready. They were validated and given the space and compassion to sit with it. Most of the time, my responses were just validating. This client really needed that validation. It was their first time kind of opening that can of, wow, what happened to me was really intense. Of course, we always use LGBTQ+ competent information, language, and resources. The client already had a safety plan, so that was helpful. We co-created strategies for self-care and next steps in reporting the abuse. We talked about that as being something they wanted to potentially do. And some of the ethical issues. I have personal domestic violence experience, so I had to balance my perspective with where the contact was versus where I was in that same position. But I felt like I was strong in that sense, where I, let myself feel what I felt and always just focus back on the client. And I was able to kind of contain what I had gone through and just show up as the therapist role. We always have on-shift supervisors that are available. So because this client was medium risk, I didn't need any approval by supervisors. However, I did debrief this with my personal supervisor after the fact, and we went through kind of each step of the way. Outcomes are measured kind of differently with the Trevor Project because it's crisis. We can only measure the difference between the start of the conversation to the end. We were able to de-escalate a little bit. When I discuss things with my supervisor, I get feedback and then I implement that into future chats that may have a similar experience. The client did report feeling supported in the moment, and they already had a safety plan, and we did some self-care practices or spoke about them before ending the chat. The first competency, ethical and professional behavior. I wrote out respect boundaries, is self-disclosure appropriate, and proper reporting. This conversation was centered around respect for the client and their experience and what they were saying about it, not using any of my own biases or anything that they weren't ready to talk about in this moment. There were a lot of boundaries with that I had to set about them asking me to give diagnoses, etc. I just assured them that that is not my job here, and they were able to respect that. Self-disclosure was not appropriate in this case. Working at the Trevor Project, it's not allowed. So that was not used. And then proper reporting. Because they were medium risk, I didn't need to report anything on my end. This abuse was not in progress, and they are over 18 years old. So we just worked on how they could report this in the future. Competency 2, human rights and justice. Always I review that Trevor research and resources, especially before sending it to a contact or client. I always stayed up to date on relevant data. And cultural competence, I used, the correct LGBTQ plus language and resources so they felt supported and not invalidated in their identity. Competency 3, ADEI. So it is an LGBTQ plus service. There's a lot of compassion used. Always use an anti-racism and anti-oppression lens. When somebody comes to us and they're using a certain label, that's the only label we use. We do not tell them how they identify. What they're identifying is X, Y, and Z, we are client focused and use everything on their terms. Competency 4 is research-informed practice. This is motivational interviewing. We use national statistics on what interventions work and what don't for our clients. And the Trevor Project has its own library of research and resources. Also understanding what context is important in the gathering information stage to make those decisions for interventions. Where do we need to dig deeper? Competency 5, policy practice. Going on what the abuse reporting legally requires us to do. I checked my boxes with this client that they are over 18, the abuse isn't currently happening. So again, we went to that next step of, are they going to report it? What steps do they need to take if they'd like to? For their suicide assessment, again, what do we need to do legally for intervention? They were medium risk, we were able to de-escalate. And like all social workers, we are mandated reporters. So if for any reason this client, re-escalated and became an imminent risk, we would take matters into intervention where that would be a self-intervention of the client, or if it would be an involuntary one that we do based on tracking their IP address. But none of those were needed today. Competency 6, engagement with client and systems. We work with the client, not for them. We focus on building rapport. I had to build a lot of rapport, especially with something as vulnerable as abuse. Like I've mentioned a bunch of times, this is person-centered work, so we are focusing on what they're experiencing, not kind of going outside of that bubble. And creating safety plans. I offered a safety plan. The client already had one that they felt comfortable with, so we just reviewed it and moved on from there. For Competency 7, assessment, we had the ASQ, which is our suicide screening questionnaire, and I identified they were medium risk. Competency 8, intervention. We did a lot of de-escalating. Even though they were imminent, the de-escalation can go further than that, where we, work towards different goals and self-care practices and coping skills within the next couple of days so that they, over time can implement that as a practice and feel more regulated. We went over reporting, how they were going to report to the police, what that would look like in their area. I had to do some on the side research during our chat to figure out, based on their area, where the nearest police station was and what paperwork they would need to find out. Again, safety plan, we always offer a safety plan at the Trevor Project. They already have one, great. And then self versus involuntary, who makes the decision? That is based on the client and where they're at. We did not have to make any intervention today. Lastly, we've got Competency 9 evaluation. I had one-on-one supervision and we checked in with this chat. I actually got feedback on this chat specifically that I didn't know they were going to pull this one randomly to evaluate, and my supervisor said it was her favorite chat of mine so far, and that it's a great example of how a quote perfect chat would go at the Trevor Project, just hitting all the marks and making sure we get to every base and provide the best care for the contact. And that was really encouraging to hear. During our supervision, though, we also brainstormed other models and what-if scenarios if this were a normal client-therapist relationship where we would have more time to build rapport and a longer, session. Lastly, we got professional self-reflection. My values and assumptions and identity definitely influences my work. I feel like I am a very inclusive and open-minded person. As I said before, there was a little bit of that transference with my history of DV, but I've noticed that being this far into practicum, I was able to use that container of mine and really not focus on my own feelings and just, identify what the contact is going through. Also, I feel like that has definitely changed over time. Before, when I was getting a chat like this where somebody was really imminent or even medium risk, they had thoughts of suicide, my heart would race. I would get a little bit panicked. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to say the wrong thing or re-escalate them. Now I feel very calm and confident in the questions I'm asking and my ability to get support if I need it. I learned a lot of lessons in my entire practicum, but a lot on this chat too. I learned, when it's appropriate to ask the open-ended questions and the closed-ended questions. Sometimes there's a need for both. And especially with cases like this where it brings up something inside of me, I just, at the end of the day, when work is done, I really focus on my self-care and self-nurturing routine so that way I can wake up the next day and do it all over again.